Russian opposition politician Ilya Yashin is in a Moscow court again this week, defending himself against charges by the government of spreading so-called fake news. The 39-year-old appeared in front of a judge on Wednesday to hear charges that his YouTube live stream in June, during which he spoke about civilians killed by the Russian military in the Ukrainian city of Bucha, was a violation of a new wartime censorship law that prohibits citizens from publicly discrediting the Russian army. Yashin is one of many political prisoners in Russia now behind bars for speaking out against the war in Ukraine. But until his arrest in June, he was seen as the most popular opposition leader still living freely in the country. On Wednesday, prosecutors asked the judge to keep Yashin in pre-trial detention for another 6 months, claiming the longtime activist is a flight risk and citing his one-third ownership in a Bulgarian apartment as proof of that risk. In fact, the Kremlin has been detaining opposition leaders since before the war in Ukraine, but in February, as the so-called special military operation began, many political activists, journalists, and civil society figures have found themselves forced to flee the country in order to maintain their personal safety, except not Ilya Yashin. On Wednesday, he told the judge in the Meshchansky court he is a Russian patriot and has no plans to leave his own homeland.
I'm not leaving because I don't think I'm doing anything that goes against the interests of my country. I'm a Russian patriot.
Yashin has been a key organizer and political opposition leader since his student days. He ran for Moscow City Duma in 2005 and most recently was serving as a municipal deputy in a Moscow suburb. He is a gifted public speaker and known for passionate speeches at opposition rallies, often in support of Russia's most prominent political prisoner, Alexei Navalny. Navalny, since his 2021 return from medical treatment in Germany, has spent more than 670 days behind bars, and since August, the anti-corruption activist has been regularly removed from the general prison population for forming a prison labor union and placed in solitary confinement for more than 60 days. The 46-year-old father of two is serving a 9-year sentence for fraud and contempt of court on top of the 3.5-year sentence he received in February for violating the terms of a 2014 suspended sentence. Navalny's parole violation came while he was recovering in a German hospital after teams of Russian government agents allegedly tried to assassinate him in Siberia with a deadly nerve agent in his underpants. Navalny is also charged by Russian authorities with starting an extremist organization, which would add another 11.5 years to his current sentence if convicted. Navalny, who ran for mayor of Moscow in 2013, says he's not guilty and that all charges are part of a long campaign by the Kremlin to silence his political activity and stop the anti-corruption foundation he started in 2011. In May, and without prior notice, Navalny was abruptly moved from the Pokrov correctional colony near Moscow to the special regime facility at Melikovo, more than 200 kilometers east of the Russian capital. On November 1st, Navalny was sent into a punishment cell for the 7th time since mid-August, where he served a 15-day detention for failing to button the top of his collar and addressing a guard by rank and family name instead of the more respectful first name and patronymic. In solitary confinement, Navalny is deprived of his personal effects, extra food, and his small bed is chained up to the wall during the day. He is allowed one book for 1 hour per day and no outside contact, messages, phone calls, or extra food from the prison commissary. It is a form of torture meant to break his will and inspire fear. Nevertheless, Navalny has continued to fight for his rights and call on Russians to stop the war.
They do it to keep me quiet. So what is my first duty? That's right, don't be afraid and don't be silent. To which I urge everyone, at every opportunity, stand up against the war, Putin, and united Russia. I hug everyone.
In total, Navalny has sat in the tiny cell-like room used for prisoner punishment more than 60 days since he formed a prisoners' labor union called Promzona, which is described in detail on his Instagram account.
Well, why not? I'm an employee of a prison. I'm a doorman. And other convicts are employees too, as are the prison guards. In terms of labor rights, we aren't any different. We can form a union to protect our rights.
Through a verified social media account on the Twitter platform, Navalny's team regularly relays his updates and personal messages to the wider world. On November 17, he laid out his quest for winter boots in a threaded series of tweets that described life in his correctional colony and flashed moments of wit and candor about the state of Russia under Putin.
Prison struggle is a never-ending search for mutual vulnerabilities, and the stupid winter boots make me vulnerable. Why would prison officers need to do such petty nonsense? Well, this is a perfect example of the cunning and thoughtfulness of the penitentiary pressure system. You don't get winter boots. That means you either don't go out for a walk and suffer, or you do go out and get sick, which has already happened to me. Getting a cold is nothing if you're at home with a blanket, tea and honey. But in a cell where hot water only comes in 3 cups for breakfast, lunch and dinner, getting sick is strongly discouraged, even if it's just a cold. If you get sick, you'll have to ask the administration for things like pills, medical care, woolen socks, and so on.
There are more high-profile political prisoners in Russia at risk of being crushed by the system. In April 2022, political activist, journalist and filmmaker Vladimir Kara-Murza was arrested on charges of disobeying police orders and sent into pretrial detention, just like Yashin. And just like Yashin, Kara-Murza was also charged with discrediting the Russian army. Russian artist and musician Alexandra Skachelenko was detained by St. Petersburg authorities in March for anti-war activity that included replacing price tags in a city supermarket with information about victims of the war in Ukraine. The 32-year-old freely admits to her activism, but her pretrial detention has been extended indefinitely, and authorities have continued to add charges and harass the activist while she awaits her day in court. Including Yashin, Kara-Murza and Skachelenko, at least 73 people in Russia have been charged under the new censorship law. Many of the defendants are politicians, journalists, priests, activists, and even police officers. On July 8, Moscow municipal lawmaker Alexei Gorinov was sentenced to 7 years in prison under the law. Gorinov, a trained lawyer, was arrested in April on charges of spreading knowingly false information about the Russian army. Authorities say Gorinov and a fellow opposition deputy, Elena Katyonechkina, spoke out against the council's proposal to hold a children's drawing contest and a dance festival, despite the war in Ukraine, where Gorinov said children were dying. For more on Alexei Navalny and the state of political prisoners in Russia, we're now joined by Maria Pevchik, who is the head of the investigative unit of Navalny's Anti-Corruption Fund. Welcome, Maria. Maria, thank you so much for joining me here. Tell us more about the conditions in which Alexei Navalny is being held now in prison.
Well, the conditions are pretty extreme, I have to say. So he got the worst out of the worst deals. He is in a maximum security penal colony. So this is a specialized prison with maximum security for those who have committed more than one crime. Mostly, he's surrounded by murderers, sometimes mass murderers, and this sort of crowd. But within this maximum security colony, he isn't living a normal inmate's life either. For the past 70 or even more days, he has been transferred to a solitary confinement. So this is, in fact, like punishment cell. But the punishment is not really in solitude. The punishment is in the conditions that he's being placed in. We are talking about a tiny little room, probably 2 by 3 meters large. The walls are concrete. There is a tiny little window somewhere close to the ceiling. And in terms of furniture, all this room has is a bed, which is being chained up to the wall every morning at 6 a.m. So he cannot rest on it. He can not lay down or sit down during the day. There is a small table, and there is a stool without a back. So that's all he has. And in terms of his possessions, Navalny is only allowed 2 things in his life: a book and a mug. So that's all he owns at this very moment. For 35 minutes a day, he's being given paper and pen so he can write letters. He can respond to some correspondence that he receives. And for about an hour a day, he gets to go for a walk. I do those quotation marks because that's not really a walk. It's just a cell next door, a very similar one, but without a ceiling. So that's essentially just a concrete box without a lid. So before last week, he was just constantly sentenced to 14 days there, like a rolling sort of punishment. He would be released and then on the same day sentenced again for some minor violation. But something has changed last week, and the prison administration has decided to keep him in a solitary confinement permanently until the end of his sentence.
How would you explain why is all this happening? I mean, they put him into jail. Why are they doing things which look more like a torture? I mean, is it an act of revenge from the Kremlin, or is it a message for those in Russian society who are not agree with the actions of the Kremlin these days?
I think it's actually neither. I think it's a punishment. It's a very clear punishment for Navalny's anti-war position. If you think about it, he has been probably the most vocal anti-war critic among the people who are in Russia at the moment. That there is no one's voice that is louder, and quite obviously there isn't anyone who carries this level of risk each time that he makes an anti-war statement. And each time we get to read messages from Navalny through his Instagram, or each time we get to see him through the prison camera during the court hearings, he uses this moment not to talk about himself, but rather to talk about the war, to appeal to his massive audience on Instagram and other social networks, trying to convince them that it still makes sense to protest. It still makes sense to be loud and to criticize Putin and Putin's circles for what they have done to Ukraine and to our country, Russia, as well. So I think there is a clear correlation between Navalny being a very, very vocal anti-war voice and the conditions in prison that he's being kept at.
My last question, these conditions in which Navalny is being held now in prison, and your activities at anti-corruption foundations, your activities and activities of your colleagues, this situation with Navalny in prison, is it tidying your hands or not?
Well, in fact, it's doing the opposite, I think. We are very used to incredible amount of pressure being applied to our NGO. If you think about it, a simple NGO that does the very, the thing that is pretty easy to explain. We just fight corruption. We don't do anything wrong, we don't do anything evil. But we've been under incredible, immense pressure throughout the time of our existence. And our strategy throughout all of these years, our strategy has been to fight back and to increase the stakes every time when there is a chance. So by no means our hands are completely untied. And to every evil and bad things that we do to Navalny, we respond with investigations, with work on our news channel, Popular Politics, with sanctions, lobbying, and with every other activity that our NGO does. So we are doing very opposite. The more pressure they apply on us, the more pressure we apply on them. We want them to learn and to really understand fully that throwing Navalny into jail and calling us a terrorist organization and kicking us out of the country isn't going to solve their problem. We're going to work as well as we did when we were in Moscow, and probably even better.
Well, thank you so much, Maria Pevchik from Anti-Corruption Foundation here on TV Rain.